Hello and welcome to the Independence Age Friday briefing. Those of us watching or taking part in the nationwide Jubilee celebrations last weekend could be forgiven for thinking that life has pretty much returned to normal. But underneath this veneer of normality, the data tells us a different story. Hospital numbers with COVID are on the rise again after a 2-month decline. So are we about to see another wave of the virus? And if so, how do we stay safe this time, given that all legal mitigations have now been lifted in England, very few remain elsewhere in the UK, and community testing is all but non-existent? These are just a few of the questions that we're hoping to answer over the next hour. We don't have any guest speakers today, but we wanted to devote the whole session to your questions. Before we get started on that, I'm going to hand over to Professor Christine Pargle, who's going to talk us through the latest numbers.
Hi, so let me share my screen. Okay. Right, so I last did the numbers on the 6th of May, and I was just looking back at what I said back then, and my headline was that we were out of this wave, which was the BA2 wave, but counting the consequences, and a new one might be on its way in a month or two. That's what I said. And my headline today is that a new wave is now starting. I'm going to try and cover just quite a lot because I think there's just a lot to catch up on. Just, you know, as Benita said, people kind of acting like COVID's gone away. It hasn't gone away. And I'm hoping that, you know, this presentation will give you an idea of actually where we are with it and what we need to do about it. Start with the new variant time. So this is looking at the kind of proportion of sequence cases that are each variant in England up to, this is up to the 6th of May, so up to when I gave my last talk. So you can see we had 6 months really from last summer onwards till Christmas where Delta was the dominant variant in England. Then we had the first Omicron wave, which was BA1. Then we had the second Omicron wave in March, which was BA2. And now we've got a new one coming. We're here in the red. Now, this time we don't have one variant, we have 4 variants that are all increasing rapidly. There's BA4 and 5, which is the variants that South Africa just had a wave with. There's BA 2.12.1, which is dominant in the US. And then there's a new one, BA 5.1, which is a child of BA5. And you know, you can have dominant variants, but they don't necessarily cause a new wave of infection. So I just wanted to show you what it looks like in England, what it has looked like when we compare dominance of variants over the last 6 months with the ONS infection survey, which tells you how many people in England had COVID. So this is again up to end of April this year. And this grey line now is showing you the percentage of people who had COVID over that time. So you can see here is the initial December wave, here is the March wave. And here ONS prevalence started going up as Omicron was increasing really rapidly. It actually started going up a bit before Omicron reached dominance, partly because Delta at that point was also increasing before it got out competed. Then prevalence dropped at the end of January and early February as BA2 was starting to rise. And it's not until they crossed over here towards the end of February that you start seeing ONS prevalence go back up. And we actually had a higher peak with the second Omicron wave than we did with the first Omicron wave. And then towards the end of April and over the last month, we've seen prevalence coming down every week for the last, 6-7 weeks. But now we're back at this crossover point, and you can see that actually the latest thing is now it's stopped declining, and the latest indication ONS is that there's been a slight increase in England, and we're exactly back here. So we should expect this to go up again. We will have a new wave of infections this month. Now, hopefully it won't be as high as the previous 2 waves. It might be lower, but we can't count on that. And either way, we are going to see more people becoming infected. And I'm now just going to show you how this red line breaks down between these 4 variants. So you can see individually, they're all somewhere between 6 and 15% of sequenced cases. They're all kind of BA 2.12.1, BA5 and BA4 all around the same and have kind of grown the same over the last few months. BA 5.1 is new. It's only been a couple of weeks. And that is now dominant in Portugal. It's a child of BA5. So if you kind of think about BA5 and BA 5.1 together, they're kind of winning the race. So it's likely that ultimately we'll probably end up with BA5 winning this wave. Now, what is a bit frustrating about this to me is that when I first raised this a month ago, we were here and each of them was less than 1% of cases. So it's not a surprise that we're here, right? It's not a surprise that we have a new wave. You can see it in the data. What's happened is that people don't want to look. And we're kind of just closing our eyes to it. We're now doing fewer and fewer PCR tests, so it's going to be harder to do this in the future. But the fact is we shouldn't be surprised, but this is now our third wave in 6 months. So we had kind of 6 months of Delta, but now every 2 months, like Omicron, the Omicron children are better than Omicron successively, and that didn't happen with Delta. So what do we know about BA4 and 5? So there was a paper that actually just came out this week from the Imperial Virology team, and they kind of did lots of different tests, and I'm just going to summarize what they kind of said. So they said, firstly, in terms of people who were boosted, you have a similar response to BA4 and 5 than we did to BA1 and 2. So in that sense, if you're vaccinated, you're about as well protected against BA4 and 5 as you would have been against BA1 and 2. But the difference is that now almost everybody in the UK is several months out from their booster unless they've had the spring booster. So everyone under 75, or most people under 75, and now have much less protection just because of the waning. They also looked at previous infections. So if you've been infected with Delta, which was from last summer to last December, that gives you the least protection against any Omicron variant. They're so different, those two variants, that they don't really protect against each other. If you were infected in the December-January Omicron wave, you do have less protection now against these new variants than you did against BA2, which was the last wave. If you were infected in March, April with BA2, then actually you have quite good protection against BA4 and 5. So everyone's kind of approaching this next wave with kind of different levels of protection. If you've had the booster plus Omicron, that gave the highest level of antibodies against BA4 and 5, but it's still lower than it was against the previous variants. So what if we kind of try and look at other countries and see, okay, what does it mean there? So if we look at South Africa, they've now passed their wave. They had far fewer hospitalizations than they did under the first Omicron wave. So in a sense, for them, they definitely had a wave of infection, but it was less serious. I'm not going to show deaths for South Africa because they tend to be quite lagged. And so we don't really know what they are for this wave yet. But if we look at Portugal, who's in the middle of their BA5 wave, this is the number of patients in hospital per million people in Portugal, you can see that actually their BA5 wave still going up, and it looks like it will be around the same size at least of their first Omicron wave in January. And so in that sense, kind of the virulence of these new Omicron variants are still quite unclear, and everything's kind of mediated by vaccination and previous infection. There have been some kind of lab studies that I'm sure Danny and Steve could talk to, that, or Aris, kind of showing that potentially they might be more virulent, but it's really unclear, and we're not really seeing that in the real world yet. But most likely is that they're similar to previous Omicron variants. If we look at deaths in Portugal, we're also seeing quite a sustained spike in deaths in this BA5 wave. So again, that looks like it will be about the same as BA1. Now, the thing is, Portugal and South Africa are not the same as the UK. So neither of them had a big BA2 wave of infection, which we had in March and April. South Africa also in 2021, their big wave was beta, and our big wave and Portugal's big wave was alpha. Again, they give you quite different levels of protection against new variants. So we're kind of in a situation now, because every country's had its own kind of unique thing happen to it, that you can't really tell what's going to happen to you based on what's happening to other countries. And also in terms of BA4 and BA5, we are kind of still in the leading edge, unfortunately. So BA4 and BA5 are growing in the US, but they're not yet dominant. They're also growing in other European countries, but the next European country to be dominant is us. And I'm just showing this plot again because I just wanted to highlight this goes up to the 4th of June. We're now at the 10th of June, so it's likely now that they are dominant and BA2 is no longer dominant. The other thing that happened on the 4th of June is it was the Jubilee weekend. So we've got a situation where you're in the start of the next wave, and effectively we had a weekend where everybody was out communally. Now, hopefully most people were outside, but it's not a great kind of circumstance that happened at the same time. So as we go into this wave, with vaccination, nothing has really changed. Where it's about 2/3 of the population have had 3 doses, but these are all now last autumn and winter. We still have a significant proportion of people who haven't had any vaccine, and a lot of those are children. So you can see here I've shown the proportion of 5 to 11-year-olds in each country that have 1 dose. So that's all that's been offered so far to most children that age, and proportion of 12 to 15-year-olds with 2 doses, which is what they've been offered. And you can see that it's substantially lower than for adults, and particularly for primary school children, and particularly in England and Northern Ireland, it's very, very low. Very few children have been vaccinated. And we've just seen that actually, unless you got BA2, so the Omicron that was last March, you're not that well protected from previous infection against these new variants. And we're not really doing any vaccination at all, right? So that's also, we've finished our vaccination campaign. I think people kind of think, oh, it's over, but as I'm hopefully showing you, it's not over. And just another reminder that we're not all entering this wave with the same levels of protection. There's still quite a strong deprivation gradient where people living in the most deprived areas are just much less likely to be boosted or vaccinated. This is true for adults. It's particularly true for children. So this gradient is much starker. So again, you're coming into this situation where people have very different levels of protection. So what actually is happening? The ONS infection survey that came out today, so again, this is based on random testing, it's the most reliable thing that we have, is now showing that no country is dropping anymore, and all countries except Wales have some sign of increasing now. So given where we are, I expect that to go up again next week. If we look at age groups, the age groups that have increased are secondary school children and young adults, and then kind of their parents' generation and here. So that's kind of where it is at the moment. Hospitals are showing something similar to ONS. So Scotland and England are now flat. Northern Ireland and Wales are still going down, but they're slightly lagged their data. And admissions in England are now definitely back on the upswing. So we did thankfully drop much lower than we did between the 2 Omicron peaks in February. So we are starting now from a lower base, which is good news, but certainly it has started. So I think from this, all of this data, we can be pretty sure that we have started this next wave. In terms of deaths, we will not see any impact on deaths from this wave for several weeks yet. So please don't think that because deaths are low and they might well still decrease for the next week that we're not in a wave. We are, but you won't see it because there's quite a long lag. And on long COVID, so the latest long COVID data from the ONS came out last week, just before the Jubilee, and I just want to highlight what it's saying, because there's kind of been this idea that we're fine because we've reduced the risk of hospitalization and death. We certainly haven't got rid of it, and we're still seeing a lot of it, but long COVID remains a really big issue, and it's an issue that is getting progressively worse. So this is a number of people living with self-reported long COVID for at least 4 weeks. And this is people infected up to April. So you're just starting to see the BA2 wave. And you can see that this is the Omicron era. It's continued to go up quite significantly. We now have 2 million people reporting to be living with these symptoms now. It's not that they all got infected in Omicron. It includes people who got infected, in previous waves and all the way back to the beginning. But the point is that we're adding more people than are recovering, right? More people are getting it than are coming out because they've recovered. So it means that things certainly haven't got better during the Omicron era. And if we look at it by age, the biggest increases over time, this is time going forwards this way, is in these kind of adults aged 25 to 70. And the biggest increases are in older adults. And it really reflects the fact that they have really high infection rates, particularly 50 to 69-year-olds had very high infection rates in March. They have waning vaccine. They didn't get the spring booster. And also we know that that kind of age group is at the highest risk of long COVID. And again, I just wanted to highlight here, we now have, a significant number of people, almost 400,000 people who've had symptoms for more than 2 years since their original infection. And we're also seeing a significant number of people now being affected in the Omicron era. If you've had it for less than 12 weeks, you had Omicron, right? And this is in a highly vaccinated population and a population who had quite a lot of previous infections. So it's not, long COVID hasn't gone away because we've got the vaccine. And we can also see that, and I've showed this before, but I just want to show it again, that it definitely hits professions where you're more exposed to COVID, particularly social care, healthcare, and teaching. And just today, there was an article in the Times Education Supplement saying that more than a third of secondary schools are reporting workforce challenges due to long COVID. I mean, that's a really significant problem if you're thinking about educational provision, and that there's this real concern that long COVID is eroding our workforce and having devastating consequences. And you'll see it first in professions like social care, healthcare, and teaching, but it will affect the whole workforce, right? And this is a really bad thing for your economy and your productivity going forwards. So what can be done? Well, one thing that we can do is wear a face covering, but we're not. So the latest ONS data is showing that, fewer and fewer people are reporting wearing a face covering when outside the home or on transport. I actually think these numbers are probably higher than in real life, because I certainly am not seeing 50% of people wearing a face covering outside. One thing that the ONS survey showed, which makes me quite sad, to be honest, is this is if you're on public transport, and you can see that people over 70 and people over 50 are much more likely to be reporting wearing a face covering. And if they're wearing a really high quality mask, FFP2 or FFP3, then that will help them. But ultimately, everybody needs to be wearing a mask, right? The more people wear a mask, the better it is for everybody in that environment. And so this kind of makes me sad, because the people who are most vulnerable are trying to protect themselves, but it's a communal thing, right? So, if you're 16 to 29 or 30 to 49, you wear that mask, and you're not doing it necessarily for you, you're doing it for other people, for the people who are clearly still worried about COVID because they are wearing a mask. There's also been some new data coming out about aerosol, about airborne transmission, and just highlighting that it is really significant. And this study, they looked at how many aerosols were emitted for different activities, from just breathing, talking, and singing. And they showed that actually the really fine particles that you produce when you're talking or singing contain much more COVID than the kind of bigger ones that you do if you're not doing those things. So actually talking and singing, which we kind of knew already, but here's just more proof, are the ones where actually you do end up potentially infecting people a lot more. And those are the things that we like to do together. There's also a study that came out recently showing that indoor exercise is a risk for COVID transmission, and that actually the more intense the exercise is, you have much more emission of potentially infectious aerosols. So they said actually, you have to have really strong infection prevention measures when you're doing high intensity group exercise. So these are the things, we need to be thinking about, how do we improve those indoor environments? And a viewpoint just came out in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, about reducing coronavirus in shared indoor air. And they said, the thing is, there actually are a lot of options for doing it, right? We have loads of different ways of doing it through dilution, filtration, and disinfection, getting more and more evidence about what works. And they end by kind of saying, improving air quality is a potential not just to reduce infections with COVID, but other respiratory viruses and bacteria. Can help asthma. It can help other injuries from pollutants, right? And they kind of said this is a once in decades opportunity now to make sustained improvements to public and private indoor air quality. This is what we should be doing. And that kind of made me look back to think, 2 years ago, we had the UK ventilator challenge. It was kind of hailed as this big thing, everybody effing it, everybody kind of coming together to do this big thing to try and improve us. It was hailed as a success. It wasn't actually particularly successful. But we don't need a ventilator challenge, right? What we need is a ventilation challenge. Why aren't we doing this now? Why aren't we putting money, time, effort, publicity into trying to improve indoor air quality? We've spent so much money on vaccines. We've wasted so much money on things like PPE and ineffective ventilator challenges. We should be doing this. So just to summarize, vaccination has stalled. We just aren't really doing any anymore. All nations have infections that are now flat or going up. The new variants are now dominant, and a new wave has just started. Long COVID is now rising after the Omicron BA1 surge. Now, we haven't really got the full data from the BA2 surge. It will also rise from that, and it's very likely to rise again with the next surge now. And, we need to prioritize clean indoor air, and we really need to keep taking COVID seriously. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Christina. It really certainly feels that we've got a burning platform now, that we've got an opportunity to potentially mitigate from some risks before we head into the next winter. The question is whether we will actually do that. So we've got some really good questions actually on many of the themes that you brought up in your presentation. And our first question comes from Jenny Tipton. Is Jenny on the line?
Yes, I've just switched my camera and my mic on.
Hi, Jenny, welcome.
Hi. I'm currently receiving chemotherapy as I have cancer. My question is, how can the immunocompromised protect themselves in hospitals if mask wearing isn't compulsory?
That's an excellent question, and relevant to so many of the 3 million clinically extremely vulnerable people in the UK. Who would like to take that question? I'm not sure anyone's got the answer.
No, exactly.
The problem.
Apart from mask wearing yourselves. But
Helen, shall I come to you?
Yeah, I just want to say it's really, really difficult, Jenny, and I think we all feel for patients. There's some recently published stuff on hospital-acquired infections, and clearly there is a lot of hospital-acquired COVID and a lot of not testing for it.
Yeah.
I think that certainly in our local hospital, they are drawing distinction between wards where people who are definitely like to be immune compromised, such as the oncology wards. Different things are happening there than in the hospital as a whole. But there does seem to be a fairly central directive, is that generally we don't need masks anymore, which is really, really disappointing. And I'm quite distressed that our local trust isn't actually saying, but this is nonsense. Because I suspect they're having pressure put on from above. I don't know that for a fact, but I can't see a good reason for stopping the mask wearing. And I think it's very difficult. And if you go to a general ward, there's not a lot of mask wearing going on, and there is quite a lot of hospital-acquired infection. Sorry, that wasn't much help, but I think oncology wards make
no. In the chemo centre in my trust, there is a division between the oncology, the hematology, and the day centre, and the rest of the hospital. There are some double doors, so hopefully that will mitigate it. But yeah, it's difficult because obviously we can't stop going for treatment.
I'll just take one more comment from Susan on this, and then we'll move on to the next question.
Many years ago, I was involved in an evaluation of an NHS campaign, which was called Clean Your Hands campaign. It went throughout all of England, and it involved posters up in the wards that were changed regularly, asking people to clean their hands. It involved encouragement of patients to ask clinicians to clean their hands before being with them. It also had hand sanitizers, it has equipment, so hand sanitizers at the end of every bed. And what we need now is a clean your air campaign throughout the NHS. If we could do it for hands, why can't we do it with air? So I think that's just, I wanted to bring in that concept that I think we should really be looking at something like this. And I think it is going to have to be a sort of bottom-up movement that begins demanding these kind of things, with different organisations coming together to ask for it.
And I think it's wider than just COVID, as Christina has pointed out. Well, air pollution is a problem for many reasons, and this is an opportunity to, it's a no-brainer, isn't it? Probably would save money to ventilate systems properly and make people's health better. Steve, did you have a very quick point you wanted to make before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, just a very quick point, because I think your problem is very immediate, and it's obviously very concerning because you have to go in for therapy. The best possible thing you can do is to wear a tightly fitted FFP3 mask, not the ones looping around your ears, but with the elastic going in the back of your head.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
Those fit better. They have a much better seal around the mouth and nose, and that really, as well as limiting time and sort of kind of trying to keep your distance, and ask for the windows to be open and things like that. Maintain your distance if the room is ventilated and what have you. Those are the best protection that we can use for against a respiratory virus. So I would recommend those masks. They cost a tiny bit more, but really not that much. And they're on Amazon. You can find them quite easily. Make sure they're EU certificated. Yeah,
not the ones with the valve in it. It's the other ones, isn't it?
The ones, yeah.
Yeah,
the ones without a valve. Thank you, Jenny, and thank you for coming on, and the best of luck with your treatment. And I'm just so sorry you're in this position where you're having to think about these additional things on top of what is clearly an awful time. But thank you very much. Okay, so we're just going to move on to our next question, which is coming from Mark Oakley. Mark, do you want to pop your camera on? And hi, there you are. Thanks, Mark. Over to you.
Good afternoon. I've got pulmonary sarcoidosis, and to treat that, I'm on a fairly high dose of steroids, which makes me immunosuppressed, leaving me in a fairly vulnerable position, like many people with the vaccines. I just wanted to see what the panel's thoughts were on the effectiveness of the new treatments, such as Evusheld from the AstraZeneca have done, and whether they think it would benefit people in my position, and just really people's views on it.
Thank you, Mark. So I might come over to Sheena for that question. It might just be worth mentioning what Evusheld is.
Yes, Evusheld is a sort of combination monoclonal antibody approach. So what it's trying to do is to act a bit like it's acting a little bit like a vaccine by giving you antibodies that will be circulating in your bloodstream and will try and stop the virus, if it gets in, from being able to get into cells and cause an infection. It is being recommended for people who are immunocompromised or immunosuppressed, such as yourself. And there are government guidelines now in place for it, but I think that is an issue because I believe that there are problems with accessing it yet and the guidance about who should get it, but you can definitely put pressure on it. The initial studies certainly have looked, it seems to be quite good for a lot of the COVID strains. We're not so sure yet how it's going to perform against Omicron. The guidance is that you should get it around twice a year. Again, we're not sure about its persistence. And there is a little risk of some side effects, such as allergic reactions. So it has to be taken under supervision to make sure that you're as safe as possible. There are other monoclonals as well that may do similar roles, but this one's particularly good because it's a combination one. So it gives you the best possible chance. So I think make inquiries about it, see if it's available at all where you live. And I'm sure Steve or somebody will have something to add to this.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I know it's been approved by the MHRA, but it's not available, and as I understand, it's not available in the country yet because the government still haven't moved on it. So it's obviously frustrating.
Yes, I think it's another sort of kick really for the clinically extremely vulnerable population. And Steve, I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on Evusheld.
Sure. I mean, I think it's a huge problem that we are relying on our vaccines for the broader population and therapies for the clinically vulnerable populations to safeguard against what amounts to, as Christina showed us, is an ever-increasing number of waves of infection across this country. So yes, we can do this, we can give these therapies, but we mustn't rely on them entirely. I mean, we have to do more to get prevalence down. But Mark, obviously, you're in a situation that's very acute, it's very present, and you need these sorts of protections. Because if you are on steroids, it is probably the case that you will be at higher risk, and you probably may not have responded to boosters if you're on the steroids particularly well, etc., etc. I'm sure Danny has more to say about that. I don't know why, having been licensed, it's not being deployed, but I think we do have to be a bit careful about how we deploy it and make sure that we reserve it for those people that absolutely need it the most. Because the other issue with this is that as the virus is escaping against our own immunity we mount ourselves, there can be escape against the sorts of antibodies that are provided in these therapies. So we do have to manage that carefully, and we need to understand more about it before we give it to everybody who's clinically vulnerable, for example. So I think, watch this space. I think I agree, we just need to put as much pressure on as possible to get the right people the right treatments.
Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mark, and best of luck. I hope we can get it for you at some point.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to move on, and our next question comes from Linda Moore. Linda, are you with
Hello.
us? Hi there.
Hello. I can't get my video to start. It said someone stopped it, so I can't actually start it. But if you can hear me, then
We can hear you, Linda. Thanks for joining us.
Okay. Thank you very much for doing everything and continuing to do it for all this time. Oh, it says start my video. Right. I don't know if it's done it.
It's thinking about it, Linda.
Yeah, okay, well,
why don't you ask your question and hopefully
Yes.
it'll appear at some point.
Yeah, we'll do. Okay, so I'm concerned about vaccines. My husband and myself are a little bit less than 65, and we would nevertheless still quite like to have a vaccine. Anyway, that's a separate point. Do you know if there's any progress being made towards an Omicron specific vaccine, or if there is one that's being developed that is not specific to particular variants, and if there is a timescale where that we might be able to get something that's other than the one that's directed at the first Wuhan variant, or whatever we call it. And also the other part of the question is, if the boosters are, do you disagree or agree that boosters could be paid for people that want them, like the flu vaccines are for those who aren't eligible to get them, through having various conditions or being a certain age?
Thank you, Linda. So there's quite a bit to unpack in that question, but all very, very important points. I'll come to Danny, if I may, just to maybe pick up some of those.
Yeah, I think you raise really important points, and I'm probably going to give you a really frustrating, unhelpful answer. So my reading of the situation, yes, is that, it's a sort of moving target, isn't it? And if you'd asked a panel like this, or even government ministers or JCVI 6 months ago, we'd have had some certainty that we were on a trajectory for some kind of rolling mRNA first generation vaccine programs, as needed. And then I guess we entered a phase where we thought, well, it's all sort of dying out, it's all getting better, so let's put on hold the idea of fourth boosts at all. And then obviously we realized that Omicron was so divergent that those first generation vaccines weren't really offering terribly good protection. So we sort of entered a kind of quagmire of dispute over whether we wanted Omicron specific vaccines or broad pan coronavirus vaccines or what. And on the panels I sit on the various sort of advisory boards and things I sit on, I don't think we've come out of that mess yet. So I don't think we have any certainty of what comes next or who for. And that, that couldn't be a less satisfying answer for you. I'm sorry.
Okay. I did see something about the US military having a vaccine. Do you know anything about that? That seemed like it was, I don't know if it was a sort of semi-sterilizing vaccine as well, but not heard any more about that. or read any more about it. Or
just I won't hold the discussion, but to say one more sentence about that. So the US National Institute of Health have been fairly proactive in quite a sort of nice way at trying to promote research into vaccines that really could work across different variants. And I think the US military trial is one of the examples that you're thinking of. And it looks really promising and interesting to me. And, Christina Pargle is just saying, and what about the Moderna trial as well? So yes.
Yeah. Okay. What about the point? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say we just got one more point about the buying of vaccines. I don't know who wants to take that. It was an opinion. Do you think we should be making them available to people who want them if they're willing to pay? Kit, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, hi. It's a good question. I, like you, I'm not eligible currently for a booster. I'm a little bit less than 65 as well. At the moment, the JCVI on the autumn programme is that there's going to be a booster available for residents of care homes and older adults, people working in care homes, frontline health and social care workers, everyone over 65, and clinically risky, clinically vulnerable adults between the ages of 16 and 64. So it's not going to be currently a widespread progress. And personally, with the the potential for further variants, further waves coming in the winter, I would like to protect myself, and I'm sure lots of other people would as well. When it comes to paying for vaccines, we of course have to be really careful, because we open ourselves up to inequity or inequality in that middle class people who are concerned about it will go and get themselves vaccinated, but many people might not be able to afford, especially with the cost of living crisis that we're going through at the moment. So some degree of potentially means testing, making it available for people on lower incomes, if we were to go down that route, would be really important. But ideally, we wouldn't be playing into this narrative that COVID has just gone away. We would be thinking more carefully about offering the vaccine to a wider range of people in the autumn.
I just think if people could pay for it, even if they are people that can afford it, then the more people who have had a booster, then that's better for society. And if something like you say, a means tested trial could be done as well, that would be even better still. But
thank you, Linda.
I would happily turn up and pay, just like for the flu jab.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Linda. I don't know if anyone had one final word to say on that. Sheena, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to talk a little bit about the trials. So the good news is there are a variety of trials happening across the world looking at different types of vaccines, including ones against Omicron. Some of these haven't worked as well as they hoped, and perhaps one of the reasons for that is because Omicron keeps changing. So it's a bit of an arms race trying to make sure that we stay ahead of the game, so they don't look to be performing much better than the current batch of vaccines that we have. There's also interest in looking at what our T cells are doing. These are the other bit of the immune system that's very, very important in infections. And they don't seem to be as fussy about recognizing the spike as our current batch of vaccines have. And it's the spike bit that's really changing an awful lot between variants. There are other changes, but the spike is a big change. And so possibly these T cell vaccines might allow us to have some degree of protection, but it's unlikely to be complete sterilizing immunity. And these trials are underway as well.
Thank you, Sheena. So I think that's credit to the incredible scientists that just continue to work so hard on developing the vaccines for us. So I'm going to move on, and our next question comes from Sammy McFarlane. Welcome, Sammy.
Hi, thank you for having me. So the government says we have to learn to live with COVID-19. Therefore, children must learn to live with repeat infections and the ongoing risk of long COVID. Today, iNews has reported that the Education Secretary has asked officials to draw up new guidance on long COVID for schools as cases continue to rise among teachers and support staff. The DFE research published last month found that the condition was causing workforce challenges in more than a third of secondary schools and more than a quarter of primary schools. Yet there has been no investment in improving the indoor air quality in schools to improve health and learning outcomes for education staff, but also the children. Biomedical research in adults suffering from long COVID has found blood clots, organ damage, including brain changes and increased prevalence of diabetes, for example. Given that the ONS data reports 115,000 children and young people are living with long COVID in the UK, how much funding has been allocated to biomedical research for children? That is research which does not focus on psychological impact of SARS-CoV-2 infection. Thank you.
Thank you, Sammy, for that very sobering and important question about our schools. And there is no doubt that teachers have been, they're second to health and social care staff, as Christina said earlier, in suffering the effects of COVID and long COVID. I'm happy to take the answer as best I can. I'm not aware that any funding has been specifically allocated to biomedical research in children. The NIHR did provide £50 million worth of funding, which I think the grants were allocated at a time where the biomedical research we've seen across the world have really not taken off. And so a lot of that has gone into non-biomedical research, although there are, of course, some excellent trials and studies going on, but that's all in the adult world. I think one of the challenges that we've got is that we haven't got the same drive to get the research off the ground as we had with the vaccine, with the treatment of acute COVID. And so what is now happening is people who are in academic institutes are having to apply for grant processes in a competitive way, which may or may not be successful through the usual routes, which can often take a couple of years, at least 6 months or longer. And we're not as a country being incentivized to drive that forward. I think the other thing that's really struck me over the last while is that researchers are exhausted and burnt out like everyone else, because they've just come through 2 years of sorting out the acute treatment of COVID and things. So it's kind of a perfect storm, but it's not something that would be unsolvable if the political will and the financing was there. And I think that's the issue, that we have not prioritized this as a research priority for children, which is very upsetting for anyone who's struggling with a child with long COVID. Would anyone else like to comment on that, and particularly the education aspects that Sammy has raised? Kit?
Just going back to the Times Education Supplement article you mentioned, which addresses the suggestions that the Education Secretary is putting forward, or having consultation on about what to do about long COVID in teachers in schools. One of the suggestions there is to give teachers who have long COVID 12 months of fully paid leave to try and deal with this, which sounds like an incredibly expensive idea. And I guess as we've seen over and over again with COVID, prevention is always better than cure. Wouldn't it be so much better if we could put the money that we were spending on that into making schools safer and doing all the things that Christina talked about in terms of making air safe, and not just in schools, but in other occupations as well. We know that healthcare workers, social care workers, teachers are up front and the people who are having to bear the impact of long COVID the most, but it is happening in other professions as well, and we're going to be paying the economic cost of that in other places. It's just going to be more hidden. So I think, one way to avoid long COVID and to mitigate its impact is to stop people from getting COVID, and to do that we need to treat COVID differently, unfortunately.
Thank you, Kit. I'm just going to come over to Danny for the final word.
Yeah, no, just a very quick point. Sorry, you asked about funding for research, and especially for children. So the simple answer, as you know, is that there's been desperately little. We've got a sub-project in our long COVID award, which is for paediatric long COVID, but there's not a lot out there. And my fear is that after those 2 tranches of money to NIHR for the initial long COVID research, there may be a sense that that's job done. Whereas in fact, it's barely touched the surface of it for what I think is going to be our sort of biggest health problem and health expenditure in the NHS over the next 5 or 10 years. So we're really going to curse ourselves if we don't try and crack it now. So all I can say is, Sammy, you've done such an amazing job up to now at campaigning and grabbing people's ears. Just please do it more, because we need so much more stuff.
Thank you, and I'll echo that, Sammy. You've done a wonderful job, but you shouldn't be having to do it at the same time. It's a shame that you're in the position where you have to. Okay, so thanks for that question, and I'm going to move on now to Steve Lawrence, who has joined us live. Hi, Steve.
Can you hear me? Good. Hello, panel, and thank you so much for all of the marvellous work you do. A simple and short question. What long-term damage to internal organs, brain, heart, lungs, and so on, can we expect following mildly symptomatic infection, even after vaccination and boosters?
Excellent question, and links very nicely to the conversations that we've had just before. So Danny, over to you for this, perhaps.
Sorry, I'll try and answer briefly to give other people a chance. So, obviously the starting premise here is that you're referring to is that for for any COVID, one of the real shockers has been obviously the way that this virus behaves in terms of even quite mild infection, resulting, as we've seen from the start, in CT changes in the lung, MRI changes in the brain, MRI changes in the heart, et cetera, et cetera. It's been, a really unexpectedly horrible and pernicious virus. And so when you come on to times of vaccination and Omicron, my hope had been, just rationally that a so-called mild infection in a vaccinated population shouldn't do any of those bad things. And yet, as you saw in Christina's graphs, in terms of long COVID, it's still doing tons of bad things in tons of people. So that leads me to suspect that when the data come through on things like the MRI imaging, the PET imaging, the CT imaging, we will see that even mild, so-called mild Omicron in a vaccinated population is producing, unexpectedly severe end organ damage. But I'll see what other people think.
Yeah, there certainly is a lot of evidence from large studies now, Steve, about the impact, which breaks down the impacts that people who've been on intensive care versus hospitalized versus mild, which is non-hospitalized. Of course, we know you can be quite ill and not be in hospital. And universally, it shows that the risks of all sorts of things are increased after mild infection. That includes heart attacks, strokes, heart rhythm disturbances, kidney decline, lung defects, brain changes, blood clots. So it really worries me on a population health level that we have already got quite an unhealthy population with high levels of obesity, diabetes, etc. And the mild COVID infection en masse will be making that population just that bit more unhealthy for various reasons. And I think that's going to be a massive challenge, as Danny has already alluded to, in our NHS over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And of course, we're seeing the same in children as well, slightly different impact perhaps, but worrying findings. Anyone else want to come in on that at all? Steve?
Yeah, I just think, it's worth saying that, post-viral problems happen with other viruses, frequency, severity, and together in the way that it happens with this virus. We seem to have this will in this country, not in this panel, but certainly some people seem to have this will to treat this virus in terms of just like influenza, which we know a lot about, in terms of how we're trying to vaccinate against it, for example, and how we're trying to mitigate it. And we really don't understand enough about this virus yet to be able to do that. And I think, as Benita and Danny have said, this is causing far more wide-reaching consequences upon infection. We just don't understand what it is. And so to just switch the smoke alarm off at this point is really maddening, and we need to understand more about it and what the damage is. And of course, the best way to prevent the damage, as Kit says, is to prevent the infection.
Thank you, Steve. And thanks very much, other Steve Lawrence, for joining us as well, and for asking such an important question. So it's moving on to our last live question, which is from Tom Magner, who's joining us from Carers World.
Thank you very much indeed for taking my question. I'm the Health and Social Care Editor for Carers World Live on the internet. Christina, early on you said you thought people were hiding from COVID. I think that's probably true in my experience of our audience, but I don't know whether this is good or bad news. Their thoughts about COVID are not that far below the surface, and all you have to do is say the word mask. And in my case, I retweeted, Susan, your tweet with the picture of you with a mask on. I'm still dealing with the reaction now. I don't know how many weeks it is since then. And I'm really interested to know, some people say, yeah, it's a good idea, it's thoughtful to others. Some, as one of your earlier viewers said, it's essential to their health to wear them. Others say, well, you know, this is ridiculous. There's no evidence that masks are any good at all. And what on earth's wrong with you for wearing a mask? So I'd be really interested in the panel's views on why does this subject evoke so much passion despite the medical advice? Thank you.
I might let Susan just come in and perhaps explain to those who might not be aware of what happened after that tweet.
Yeah, actually, the background to that was my daughter was abroad on holiday, and I said, send me a photograph. And she sent me a photograph, and she said, send a photograph of you. So I sent a photograph of me sitting on a train in a mask. And then I thought, many people that I know who are 100% aware of the problem and also about the evidence, the efficacy of masks, were beginning to get embarrassed about wearing them, because sometimes there'd only be one or two people on a bus or in a rail carriage. And so, you know, we're actually leaving them in their pocket or their bag. And so the motivation for doing that was, I thought, well, I've got this photograph, I might as well put it up as a role model that it's fine. You know, it's fine to be the only person on a rail carriage wearing a mask. And actually the carriage still had signs up saying, please wear a mask. So that was the motivation. And I have to say, it didn't cross my mind that it would be such a tsunami of angry responses. So your question, Thomas, to why, I mean, in the United States, the whole face masking thing was politicized very early on when it really wasn't here. So it's a shame that that has crept in. I mean, on Twitter, you just don't know how many people are from the States or from here. I mean, a lot of the people actually had flags, you know, as part of their background image. So either the Stars and Stripes or the Union Jack. So you got a bit of an idea. But I think it must be because in some way, I think there's a mixture of reasons. I got the impression that some people don't want other people to be showing what you should be doing because it might make them feel bad, and they don't want to feel bad because actually it's a generous thing to be wearing a mask, because nobody wants to wear a mask particularly, but it is looking after other people as well as yourself. So I think that's part of the motivation. I think for some people it's seen as an awful infringement on human rights. But, you know, we had this sort of thing before seatbelts came in. There was that sort of person, I'd say, saying, this is terrible to have this inflicted on us. But nobody bats an eyelid now. But that was because everybody was behind that. The government was behind it. There was mass communication, you know, behind it. There's legislation. Nobody ever questions it now. Everybody does that. And in some societies, wearing a mask is very similar. It's routine. It's seen as good manners, etc. But it does require a whole society leadership and change to, you know, have this very basic public health measure adopted as something sensible rather than something to be attacked.
Thank you, Susan. So there's something about culture, isn't there, and modelling behaviour and leadership. I'll bring Stephen Reicher in now. It's okay.
I was in Germany this week, and in Germany, on the underground, in the airports, in shops, people wear masks. And therefore, you know, there are societies still where people take these things seriously. And I think, as Susan said, there are a clear set of factors which are really important. The first is, if you look at the literature on the most important factor in terms of adherence to virtually any measure, it was a sense of collective identification, a sense of community. So first of all, there was a huge study on about 60,000 people from over 40 countries showing that a sense of belonging to a national community was critical to adherence. Similar studies about belonging to a local community. And the rhetoric has changed. That sense of community has been destroyed in all sorts of ways. As I say, first of all, it's been destroyed rhetorically. We talk about personal responsibility, which says it's all about it's all about you taking responsibility for yourself. No, it's about us taking responsibility for each other. And we shouldn't be talking about individual responsibility. We should be talking about social responsibility. As we know, the government has trashed a sense of we're all in this together by its own behaviour in various ways as well. Also through the ways that instead of supporting people, it blamed people and pointed fingers at people, and it turned people against each other. So I think one of the most important lessons that we've learned is a sense of community is critical. We need a government and we need a leadership which creates a sense of community, but our leadership and our government have undermined that sense of community. On top of that, I think the other factors which Susan points to are extremely important. Mask wearing has been politicized. It's been dragged into exactly the same argument that was central to Brexit, which is politicians are against you, trying to control you. We've got to get rid of politicians and European politicians. That sort of argument is being now used around mask wearing, whereby it's become a symbol of a political class or an elite. And sometimes people who attack us as Independent Sage position us as part of the elite that is trying to control you. So it's become an issue of control rather than of health. And again, I think our government has been part of those culture wars and for that division. But fundamentally, I think there's one further factor, and it tells us something very basic about human behavior. And that is often what is more important to our behavior is not what we think, but what we think that others think. And there is a lot of research which shows that when you think something, but you believe others don't, you won't do it. And vice versa, okay? And that's why I think that Susan's picture was so important and so brave, because one of the most important things you can say to other people is, actually, not everybody thinks it's gone away. And therefore, even if we're in the minority, and even if people laugh at us and attack us, I think wearing masks in public is a really important act to say it's still here, and other people think it's still here, and we need to rebuild that consensus that we need to do something, or else the cost will be huge.
Thank you, Stephen. I think we've got time for one more quick question, and it kind of fits with that same theme that we've been talking about. Lots of us are looking forward to getting away for our very first holiday in 3 years this summer, and we know the chaos on the planes, but there's a question that's come in from Tina via Twitter, who said she'd like to know what kind of protection we think passengers on planes should be wearing, and is air safe whilst at altitude, and is the air being filtered? Who would like to quickly come in on that? Christina?
So I am going on my first foreign holiday in 2.5 years next Friday. So it's a subject on my mind as I'm thinking about what to do. So I will definitely be taking an FFP3 mask with me to wear, not just on the plane, but in the airport. So I think actually in planes, they have pretty good air filtration. But I mean, I will be wearing it on the plane, but it's also like in the crowded departure hall and arrival halls that I'll be wearing it, and on public transport there and back. And, you know, trying to limit the amount that I eat and drink while on the plane so that you're not kind of sharing lots of air. But that's, you know, that's all I can do really. I'm also massively restricting what I'm doing over the next 10 days because I don't want to get COVID before I go. Yeah, so I've already cancelled various things because I looked at the data and decided it wasn't worth it to me.
Thanks, Christina. And yeah, I echo that. I think planes do recirculate the same air though, so that's an issue on longer flights. But yeah, I will have an FFP3 stuck to my face the entire flight, short haul, not eating or drinking because I want to enjoy my holiday and not be off work when I get back. So that brings us to a close. Actually, that's unfortunately all we've had time for, but it's been a brilliant discussion. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today, to those of you who sent questions in, and thanks as always to our panel of experts and the guests that have taken the time to join us live. So we'll be back next Friday with a special session on long COVID, same time, same place. Stay safe and keep well.
Thanks. Bye all.
Thanks. Bye.